Case 1. The murder of Tanya Lee Glover. In January 2010, 38-year-old Tanya Lee Glover quietly disappeared from her modest room in Fortitude Valley, Brisbane. She was a woman facing dual sensory impairments, living in supported housing, largely detached from family and friends. On the surface, her life seemed unremarkable, and precisely because she stayed under the radar, her vanishing went unnoticed. No missing person report was ever filed, as those who cared believed she was simply living elsewhere. Then, on December 7, 2022, cleaners in the Allerley suburb of Brisbane discovered skeletal remains behind a concrete partition in the storage area of an apartment block. The body was found wrapped in several layers of clothing and bedding, stowed away in the void of a wall. Initial investigations by the Queensland Police Service Homicide Investigation Unit immediately treated the location and condition of the remains as clear evidence of foul play. Because Tanya had been off the radar for so long, identification required a painstaking process. In August 2023, using familial DNA analysis and genealogical methods, investigators confirmed the identity of the remains as Tanya Lee Glover. What made the case especially challenging was Tanya's vulnerable situation. Having moved from New South Wales to Queensland in 2006, she was living at an affordable housing unit for people with disabilities. Her tenancy payments continued automatically after her disappearance, and staff assumed she had simply relocated or entered hospital care. Neighbors noted her departure, but presumed she had chosen to go away. Property managers remembered Tanya as quiet and kind. This anonymity, combined with the lack of an active footprint, allowed her case to drift into obscurity without police awareness. Once the identity had been confirmed, investigators shifted their focus to reconstruction. In March 2025, 61-year-old Vanessa Lee Turner was arrested in Townsville and charged with murder, misconduct with a corpse, and fraud. The police allege that Turner was a friend of Tanya's and that the two women had lived in the same complex, though not necessarily together, around the time of Tanya's disappearance. Authorities further allege that the murder occurred in January 2010 and that the body was moved to the void in the Alderley building where it remained for more than a decade. Throughout the investigation, detectives emphasized the complexity of tracing a timeline of events after so many years had passed. The case was described as starting almost like a cold case from scratch, and although the murder may have occurred around 15 years earlier, the commitment to justice remained undeterred. A reward of $500,000 remains offered for information leading to a conviction, signaling the seriousness with which the Queensland Police continue to treat the case. For Tanya's family, the confirmation that her remains had been found and identified brought a measure of relief, and yet, the pain of never having seen her again endures. A community built around affordable housing and support services has been forced to confront the question of how someone could disappear so completely and remain hidden in the city for so long. Beyond the individual tragedy, the case has raised broader concerns about the social systems designed to support vulnerable adults and how easily they can fail those they are meant to protect. As of now, Turner remains in custody, pending committal mention in Brisbane. The legal proceedings are still in their early stages, and investigators continue to follow up with witnesses who may have seen Tanya in her final days, or noticed something unusual at the complex in 2010. The unanswered questions: why did Tanya's disappearance go unnoticed for so long? What exactly happened to her in January 2010? And who else may hold knowledge of the events? Linger. At the end of March 2025, police launched a renewed public appeal. If you have any information, however small, please come forward, investigators urged. The case remains open, and the search for truth continues. Because for Tanya Lee Glover, justice may finally be getting underway. Where are you watching from? Drop your locations in the comments below. If you made it to this point, drop your comment with "I am still here." Let's see who is still watching. Case 2. The murder of Nancy Marie Benelak. It was the kind of case that haunted detectives long after the headlines faded. On the night of October 25, 1970, in Sacramento, California, 28-year-old Nancy Marie Benelak was at home in her upstairs apartment at the Tahitian Apartments on Bell Street. A court reporter for Sacramento County Superior Court, Nancy was widely respected in her field, sharp, professional, with a bright future ahead. She was also engaged to be married just weeks later. That evening she spoke with her fiancé on the phone and then prepared for bed. But before the sun rose again, her life had been stolen in a violent home invasion that left more questions than answers. The following morning, when Nancy failed to show up for work, her co-workers grew concerned. A colleague's son accompanied the building manager to perform a welfare check. They found the front door locked, but when they went around the back and slid open the patio glass door, left slightly ajar for her cat, they walked into a nightmare. Nancy was discovered in her bedroom, lying in a pool of blood, with signs of a violent struggle. Detectives would later confirm she had been stabbed multiple times in a sustained and personal attack, and the scene bore signs that the assailant had tried to avoid leaving behind identifiable fingerprints. Investigators believed the killer had accessed Nancy's second-floor apartment by climbing onto the balcony and entering through that same sliding door. A trail of blood stretched from the bedroom, across the apartment, down the balcony railing, and into the parking lot, a clear indication that the assailant had injured himself during the crime. However, the killer had made efforts to avoid leaving behind fingerprints by wrapping his fingers in masking tape, a rare tactic that suggested premeditation. Still, it was this very blood, left behind decades ago, that would one day become the key to solving the case. Back in 1970, forensic tools were limited. Detectives launched a sweeping investigation, interviewing over 500 people in the first month alone. Among them was a man named Richard John Davis, who lived in the same apartment complex at the time. He and his roommate provided mutual alibis, and Davis did not stand out as a suspect. With no witnesses, no confession, and only physical evidence too advanced for the science of the day, the case went cold. Years passed. Nancy's parents, desperate for justice, passed away without knowing who was responsible. Her fiancé moved on, but never forgot her. Her colleagues remembered her as someone who brought grace and excellence into the courtroom, a voice for justice silenced in the most unjust way. Despite dead ends, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office refused to give up. In 2004, advances in DNA technology allowed forensic analysts to develop a full DNA profile from the blood left at the scene. They entered it into national databases, but no match was found. The profile sat untouched for over a decade until a fresh wave of technology emerged, forensic genetic genealogy. This same approach had recently cracked the Golden State Killer case, and in 2019, detectives turned their attention back to Nancy. The Cold Case Unit partnered with genealogical specialists to build out a family tree based on the DNA profile. Working backward from distant relatives, they slowly narrowed in on a potential suspect, Richard John Davis. Although he had died in 1997, his name had appeared in the original investigation files. With cooperation from Davis's surviving relatives, a direct DNA comparison was made, and it was a match. Richard John Davis is the person responsible for Nancy Benelak's death, announced Sheriff Jim Cooper in an emotional press conference in August 2022, flanked by detectives who had worked the case across generations. Though he will never face trial, this identification brings resolution. Nancy's family, her loved ones, they finally have an answer. Born in 1943, Davis would have been 27 at the time of the murder. At the time, he worked in computer systems and was known around the apartment complex, but kept mostly to himself. Investigators believe he had a clear view into Nancy's apartment from his own unit across the pool. What his motive was, or whether he and Nancy had ever spoken, remains unclear. But detectives suspect he may have developed an unhealthy interest in her, possibly watching her movements in the days leading up to the attack. Detective Mick Duffy, who inherited the case decades later, explained, "There's no indication they had a personal relationship, but we do believe he observed her. He may have seen her routines. That patio door? It wasn't locked because she left it open for her cat. That's what he exploited." Family members of Nancy, though not present at the announcement, released a statement through law enforcement. "We never stopped thinking of Nancy. We're grateful to the investigators who never gave up. Though we'll never see justice in court, we have peace in our hearts knowing who did this. The case, long a scar on Sacramento's sense of safety, is now a benchmark for what persistence and science can accomplish. Nancy's death is no longer listed as unsolved, and the public now knows the name behind the silence. It's a story of loss, yes, but also one of technological redemption. Still, some unanswered questions remain. What exactly caused Davis to act? Had he done something like this before? Are there other victims who were never linked to him? Detectives say the investigation into Davis's past remains open. As one official stated, "Just because we identified him in one crime doesn't mean that's where his story ends." Nancy Marie Benelak's story, however, now has a form of closure, one shaped by science, driven by tenacity, and defined by a community's refusal to forget. Case 3. The murder of Lloyd Dwayne Bogle and Patricia Kalitsky. On a winter night in early January 1956, two young lives vanished under circumstances that jolted the quiet community of Great Falls, Montana. 18-year-old Lloyd Dwayne Bogle had come to Montana as an airman stationed at the nearby Malmstrom Air Force Base, while 16-year-old Patricia Kalitsky was a local high school junior, both enjoying what was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday evening. Around 9 p.m. on January 2nd, the pair left Pete's Drive-In together in Bogle's car. Bystanders at the lot remembered the scene, headlight beams cutting through snow-hazed air, Bogle at the wheel, Patricia in the passenger seat, the familiar world of teenagers about to drift into something unimaginable. The next morning, three boys hiking near the Sun River discovered Bogle's car still running. The engine idled, the emergency brake engaged, and the headlights glaring across the snow-packed ground. His body lay nearby, shot in the head, his hands bound behind his back with his own belt. Nearby, Patricia's body was found a day later in a ditch several miles from the scene. She too had been shot, and medical examiners would later document evidence of sexual assault. The horror that marched across that cold landscape left the community stunned, and detectives soon realized this was not a random act of violence. Investigators from the Cascade County Sheriff's Office opened one of the most intensive probes of the decade. Within the first month, more than 500 people were interviewed, from high school friends to Air Force colleagues, local youths to older motorists who frequented the area known as a lover's lane. Early leads drifted away. Alleged sightings, anonymous tips, uncooperative witnesses. Over time, more than 30 suspects were reviewed, among them notorious names such as James Whitey Bulger and Edward Wayne Edwards, yet none could be linked conclusively. The investigation faltered under its own weight. Evidence faded, memories grew hazy, and the case fell into the cold. A decades-long wait began. Evidence stored in cataloged boxes gathered dust. In 2001, a critical piece emerged. A vaginal swab from Patricia's autopsy revealed sperm cells that did not belong to Bogle and had no match in existing state or national DNA databases. Yet, with the technology of the day, that meant little. For the families and investigators alike, it felt like the door had been held open, but no one had the key. The turning point came in 2019 when the Cascade County Sheriff's Office partnered with Bode Technology to apply forensic genetic genealogy. The preserved DNA was processed, uploaded to commercial genealogical databases, and sifted through distant familial markers. Detective Sergeant John Cadner, who had taken charge in 2012, recalled how the database returned 3 potential relatives of an unknown male contributor. Investigators reached out, secured permission, and obtained confirmatory DNA samples from children of one match. That led them to a name: Kenneth Gould, a local resident in 1956 who had since moved to Missouri in 1967 and died in 2007. His profile matched the crime scene DNA from both Bogle and Kalitsky's cases. By June 8, 2021, the Sheriff's Office officially announced the case was closed, though in this context, closed meant solved in identity, not tried in court. Gould had no known criminal past, no documented connection to the victims, and investigators found no clear motive. He had lived near Kalitsky's home at the time, was known to ride horses in the area, and according to cell block records, had married a 16-year-old girl around the same age as Patricia. Yet direct interaction between him and the victims remains unproven. "This is as good as we're ever going to get on a case like this," Sheriff Jesse Slaughter acknowledged, "because the suspect is deceased." For the families of Lloyd and Patricia, the news brought a measure of relief, though it came painfully late. "We always wanted someone to answer for Lloyd, for Patricia, but mostly we just wanted to know," said one relative in a statement. Community members in Great Falls expressed appreciation for the persistence of investigators who refused to give up over 65 years. The case became emblematic of how even long-forgotten crimes could be resurrected by scientific innovation. And yet questions remain. Why exactly did Gould act? What triggered that night in January 1956? Are there other victims linked to the same DNA profile? Detectives continue to monitor related cases, though few believe another revelation will come. As one investigator put it, "We found the person, but we don't know exactly why." Case 4. The murder of Anna Palmer. On September 10, 1998, 10-year-old Anna Palmer left her friend's house in Salt Lake City, Utah, with the familiar freedom of a child in a safe neighborhood. By evening's end, she would lie motionless on her own front porch, discovered by her mother, empty-handed and forever changed. Anna had been walking home through the quiet streets of 300 East, chatting and smiling as children do, unaware that the trajectory of her life would shift in a single moment. Her mother, Nancy Palmer, arrived home at about 7 p.m. and found instead the unthinkable. Her daughter cold to the touch. On the spot, she should have been safe. The child whose laughter filled the neighborhood was gone, her future stolen in a brief, terrible act. Investigators from the Salt Lake City Police Department arrived quickly and found evidence of a violent assault. Anna had been stabbed 5 times in the throat, and forensic examiners later determined she had also been sexually abused. What made the case more puzzling was that it occurred near a main thoroughfare, yet no one saw the attack. Witnesses later recounted that children saw a man trailing Anna as she walked home. One described a guy in his teens with dark hair wearing a tank top, walking behind her. The presence of skin cells beneath Anna's fingernails, collected at the autopsy, suggested a brief but desperate struggle. These details would provide the bare bones of the case, but for many years, no flesh could be added. Throughout the autumn of 1998, the detective team interviewed neighbors, friends, schoolmates, and family. Police canvassed houses, distributed flyers, handled tips, and followed up on dozens of leads. Anna's mother appealed on television. "I just want to know why this happened to my daughter," she said. By year's end, more than 200 people had been questioned, yet the case lacked a breakable lead or reliable suspect. In the absence of a confession or forensic match, the investigation ground down. Evidence was locked away, caseloads turned, and the case became one of the Salt Lake City Force's most haunting cold files. For more than a decade, the case remained unsolved. But the foresight of investigators in preserving the samples proved crucial. By 2004, forensic scientists had developed a DNA profile from the skin cells under Anna's nails and the assault material, but at the time the profile returned no match in the national database. Police files gathered dust, and Anna's mother carried a photograph of her daughter that no longer reflected the present, but preserved the past. Yet change was quietly in motion. By the late 2000s, the expansion of the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, and improvements in DNA extraction allowed cases like Anna's to be re-examined in new light. In early 2010, investigators received a match. The DNA profile connected with an inmate in Idaho serving a sentence for a child-related offense. The man, later identified as Matthew John Breck, had lived in the neighborhood at the time of Anna's death and was 19 years old when the murder occurred. He was extradited to Utah and charged with aggravated murder, aggravated sexual abuse of a child, and child abuse. In a court hearing, his name echoed the long silent question that had haunted Anna's family. Why him? Why Anna? In August 2011, Breck pleaded guilty to an amended charge of aggravated murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The plea required forgoing the death penalty, but it secured a permanent conclusion. It was through science that this poor girl was able to point to her killer, said District Attorney Sim Gill. The mother, Nancy Palmer, added, "It's been a long time coming. Hopefully now we can get past her death to the good things." For Anna's community, the case now represented a measure of closure, though the ache of loss remained. Her former classmates spoke of her with tenderness. "She was outgoing, always included others. We all looked up to her," one recalled. The Palmer family organized a memorial scholarship in Anna's name for neighborhood children, turning their grief into purpose. Investigators in the cold case unit spoke quietly of the case's lessons. No disappearance is too old, no file too cold. One detective reflected, "We thought this might be our nightmare case, but we never stopped pursuing it." Even now, unanswered questions linger. Though the killer was identified and imprisoned, the motive remains largely unproven. How had Breck chosen Anna? Was she seen, or was it opportunistic? What led him from the street he lived on to the front porch where she died? Investigators continue to monitor similar cases, evaluating the possibility of linked offenses. And Anna's memory lives on in her school's library corner, her name etched permanently beside an award for friendship. Case 5. The Babes in the Wood Murders, Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway. On the afternoon of 9 October 1986, 9-year-old schoolgirls Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway left home in the Molsacum estate of Brighton to go and play near their houses, as children often did in the pre-digital era. The two friends, both living on neighboring streets, set off after school perhaps without a care, heading toward the nearby woodland at Wild Park. Their parents assumed they were safe, and when they did not return home later as expected, a sense of dread began to build. Neighbors called the police, and a search was mounted across the park, along paths and undergrowth. Just one day later, the worst fears were confirmed. Around midday on 10 October 1986, searchers discovered the girls' bodies in a hidden den of scrub and bramble in Wild Park. Both had been subject to severe harm. Forensics established that they had been strangled and sexually assaulted. The murder of two children in such a familiar setting shocked the local community deeply. The victims, Nicola and Karen, had been 9 years old, mere children whose lives were scintillating but brief. Investigators from Sussex Police immediately launched one of the largest investigations in the force's history. At the center of early suspicion was Russell Bishop, a then 20-year-old roofer who lived nearby. Bishop joined the search party himself, claiming his terrier could track human scent, and even appeared on local television appealing for information. An item of clothing, a light blue Pinto sweatshirt, found near the scene appeared to link directly to Bishop. His then-girlfriend, Jennifer Johnson, had initially identified the sweatshirt as his, but later retracted her statement during the 1987 trial, undermining the case. The trial resulted in Bishop's acquittal, and though the investigation continued, for decades the killer remained free. In the years that followed, Bishop committed another gruesome offense. In 1990, he abducted, attacked, and attempted to kill a 7-year-old girl in the same South Downs region, an act for which he was convicted and given a life sentence. This subsequent crime lent new weight to suspicions about his involvement in the 1986 murders. The turning point came with two key developments: a change in UK law and advancements in forensic science. In 2005, the double jeopardy rule was revised, allowing a person previously acquitted to be retried if new and compelling evidence emerged. Meanwhile, forensic scientists revisited samples from the original crime scene, including the sweatshirt and a taping taken from Karen's forearm using modern DNA techniques. By 2012, a massive DNA match, described as 1 in a billion, was established linking Bishop to the evidence. Bishop was rearrested in 2016, and the Crown Prosecution Service moved to quash his 1987 acquittal. Finally, on 10 December 2018, at London's Old Bailey, a jury found Russell Bishop guilty of the murders of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hadaway. He was sentenced to 2 life terms with a minimum term of 36 years. Bishop's conviction brought relief to the families after 32 years of waiting. Soon after, in 2021, Jennifer Johnson was found guilty of perjury and jailed for 6 years for her false testimony in the first trial. Although the case concluded in court, its effects continued to reverberate. In April 2024, Sussex police issued a formal apology to the families of Nicola and Karen, acknowledging serious shortcomings in the original 1986 investigation, including wrongful suspicion of Nicola's father and other failures of process. The force accepted that critical early investigative opportunities were lost and pledged reforms in how child victim cases are handled. For the families of Nicola and Karen, and for the wider Brighton community, the conviction did not erase the trauma of those October days in 1986, but it did mean someone was held accountable. One relative said, "We waited decades for our girls to be seen. Finally, the system saw them." Their legacy is remembered each year around the anniversary of their disappearance and discovery, as neighbors continue to mark the moment with candles and quiet gatherings. Yet despite the verdict, unanswered questions linger. What precisely motivated Bishop to target two 9-year-old girls playing after school? How many more children may have been affected? And why did it take so long for science and legislation to deliver justice? Investigators believe more work remains in tracing Bishop's movements and verifying whether other victims exist. The story of Nicola Fellows and Karen Hattaway is a painful reminder of the vulnerability of children and the importance of persistence in seeking justice. It underscores how forensic advances and legal change can correct past failings, yet it also highlights the human cost of delay. The Forest Den in Wild Park stands as a quiet testament to lives cut short and a community that refused to give up. If you are enjoying this content, like, subscribe, and share to your loved ones to protect them from the same tragic happening to them in the future. Case 6. The murder of Nova Welsh. On a warm summer morning in Birmingham, the quiet of the Ladywood Flats on Lighthorn Avenue was broken by the lingering scent of decay. A neighbor finally called the police on 18 August 1981, after the smell had grown so intense it could no longer be ignored. Officers entered a utility cupboard at the rear of the block and discovered the body of 24-year-old Nova Welsh, mother of two. The post-mortem would later conclude she died from pressure to the neck, in other words, strangulation. Her children were safe elsewhere, unaware at the time that their mother's life had been taken, and their home had become a hidden scene of loss. Nova had recently separated from her partner, Osmond Bell, who had been described by acquaintances as possessive and unable to accept that she had moved on. She had returned to the flat after a night out with a friend and a new relationship, and neighbors heard arguments in the days prior. The cupboard in which her body lay had been pushed shut, and the lock sealed and secured with a piece of chewing gum, an odd detail that would later become central to the investigation. Bell, who lived nearby, was arrested shortly after Nova's body was found, but due to limited forensic links and insufficient evidence, he was released, and the case went cold. For 30 years, the flat on Lighthorn Avenue remained a place of questions. Why was Nova's body concealed in such a small space? What drove the crime? A letter, sent anonymously to a friend, of Nova's naming someone else as the perpetrator, sat among the evidence, but police lacked the technological capability to tie it to anyone. The fridge, the cupboards, the notes, all lay in files. The fact that Bell had joined the initial search while police were still investigating did not itself lead to charges. The system closed the file, and Nova's children grew up without public answers. In 2014, the team at the West Midlands Police Cold Case Unit reopened Nova's file as forensic DNA technology had advanced enough to allow fresh examination of two key items: the chewing gum used to seal the utility cupboard door and the lick seal of the envelope sent to misdirect investigators. Scientists successfully extracted DNA from both and uploaded it to modern databases. Investigators soon discovered a direct match to Bell's DNA profile, which had been entered after an unrelated offense. Detectives described the match as 1 in a billion and recognized that the two items tied the suspect to both concealment and false accusation. With that breakthrough, Bell, then age 60, was rearrested in August 2016 and charged. He appeared in court in 2017 at the Birmingham Crown Court. On 22 March 2017, the jury convicted Bell of manslaughter, not murder, by a majority verdict, concluding that during a quarrel he had attacked Nova in a moment of anger and that the killing was not planned. Judge Patrick Thomas QC told Bell, "You killed her when she tried to move on with her life. You then concealed her body and caused prolonged grief to your children. Bell was sentenced to 12 years in prison. For Nova's family and friends, that conviction, arriving more than 35 years after her death, finally provided a measure of closure. One of Nova's sisters released a statement. "We never believed she would be forgotten. At last, we have truth." The community of Birmingham's Ladywood estate, once scarred by the case, now recognized the importance of preserving evidence, supporting cold case units, and reminding everyone that time itself doesn't erase responsibility. Still, unanswered questions remain. Investigators have not determined every detail of what day the attack occurred, or exactly what prompted Bell's lethal act that night. While the DNA evidence proved his involvement, the precise sequence leading to Nova's murder remains partially shrouded. Bell died in prison in January 2022 at age 55, so the full story might never be told. But in Ladywood, Nova is no longer just a name on a file. She is remembered as a mother, a sister, a woman whose life mattered. As the case closed, one senior detective reflected, "We gave Nova a voice, even if it came years later." The utility cupboard no longer holds only darkness, it holds meaning. The next chapter of this series will explore how such breakthroughs in cold case forensics have reshaped law enforcement's belief, even after decades, that justice is possible. Case 7. The Murder of Christine Jessup. In the afternoon of October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessup walked off her school bus in Queensville, Ontario, and headed home. For the Jessup family, it was a typical autumn day. Christine, the youngest child, was cheerful, bright, and trusted by neighbors. But as daylight faded and her mother Janet returned from visiting Christine's father in custody, the house was quiet. The school bag sat on the counter. Christine was nowhere to be found. A search began immediately, and by December 31st, her body was discovered in a rural field near Sunderland, about 56 kilometers from her home. The medical examiners concluded she died from stab wounds and had been sexually abused, a discovery that shattered the community and placed her family in an unrelenting state of grief. Early investigation by York Regional Police, and later by the Ontario Provincial Police, focused on the nearby neighbor, Guy Paul Morin, a man who lived across the street and was described by some as socially odd. In February 1985, Morin was arrested, and the prosecution presented an unusual mix of evidence. Microscopic hair comparisons, fiber matches from his car, and informants claiming a jailhouse confession. In a January 7, 1986 trial, a jury acquitted Morin of first-degree murder. The Crown appealed, and a second trial was ordered. On July 30, 1992, Morin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. However, that conviction could not withstand the test of evolving science. By the early 1990s, DNA technology was improving. When a new analysis was performed on semen recovered from Christine's underwear, it excluded Morin as the source of the material. On January 23, 1995, the Ontario Court of Appeal overturned his conviction and entered an acquittal. Morin was compensated by the province, and a public inquiry, the Kaufman Commission, found that tunnel vision by investigators, reliance on flawed hair fiber science, and coercive informants had all contributed to one of Canada's most notorious wrongful convictions. Morin's name was cleared, but the killer remained unidentified. The case lay dormant for decades, a haunting chapter in Canadian cold case history, until forensic genetics advanced into the field of investigative genealogy. On October 15, 2020, the Toronto Police Service announced they had identified the real killer, Calvin Hoover. Hoover was known to the Jessup family. He worked alongside Christine's father at Eastern Independent Telecom, and had even been present at the search for Christine in 1984. Ample records show Hoover died by his own hand in 2015, his DNA firmly excluded from evidence at the time. However, preserved biological material from the crime scene was reprocessed using genealogical techniques, and a match to Hoover's post-mortem blood sample confirmed his responsibility. When asked how he felt, Christine's brother Kenny said, "It all fits together now. From day one, I believed it was someone who knew us. The identification may not lead to a prosecution, but her family finally had the name they had waited 36 years to hear. "We always wanted someone to answer for Christine," her mother Janet said. "Now we can begin to get past her death." Investigators emphasized that Hoover's prior status as a family friend gave him opportunity, access, and knowledge of the household dynamics that earlier investigators missed. While motive remains speculative, police believe Hoover seized an opportunity when Christine returned home alone that October afternoon. Despite the breakthrough, unanswered questions linger. Why did Hoover never appear on the initial suspect list? How many investigative leads stayed buried in 1984-85? The Kaufman report had already concluded governmental and police systems failed vulnerable victims. Still, Christine's case became a watershed moment. It showed what happens when cold case units, preserved evidence, and genetic genealogy combine to bring resolution, even if decades later. "This case changed how we see cold case work," a senior detective said. "No disappearance is too old." For Christine's family, the resolution didn't reverse their loss, but it delivered clarity. At the annual remembrance each October in Queensville, a quiet crowd gathers around a bench in her memory. A rose is placed. A prayer is offered. "We never stopped thinking of Christine," Kenny said softly. "Now we can say her name again without not knowing." The system, though slow, finally issued an acknowledgement that the little girl who vanished on a walk home mattered, and that her story deserved a proper end. Case 8. The murder of Sharon Pryor. On the evening of March 29, 1975, 16-year-old Sharon Pryor left her home in the Pointe Saint Charles neighborhood of Montreal to meet friends at a nearby pizzeria. She walked the short distance with the usual confidence of a teenager, bright, well-liked, and dreaming of becoming a veterinarian, according to her family. But when she failed to arrive and did not return home by 11 p.m., alarm bells rang through her household. Her mother, Yvonne Pryor, called the police, and volunteers launched a search under the darkening sky, hoping for answers that would not come quickly. 3 days later, on April 1, 1975, Sharon's body was discovered in a wooded area in Longueuil, across the St. Lawrence River from Montreal. The investigation revealed she had been subjected to assault and lethal violence, and a man's T-shirt had been used to restrain her. Tire tracks were found near the scene. The discovery shattered the community and launched one of the most enduring cold cases in Quebec. Investigators at the time documented the victim's last steps, interviewed neighbors, searched the pizzeria and surrounding streets, and canvassed the neighborhood, but no arrest was made, and details remained buried under decades of uncertainty. For nearly 50 years, police investigated more than 100 potential suspects, ran repeat canvasses, and re-examined abundant physical evidence. Yet nothing broke the case. A survivor of an attempted abduction on the same street provided a description of a man. Tall, white, English-speaking, brown-haired, blue-eyed, who had approached her at knife point moments before Sharon vanished. That lead, along with the T-shirt and the tire tracks, stood idle until forensic science matured. In the meantime, Sharon's family held on to hope. Her sister Maureen later recalled, "You may never have come back to our house that weekend, but you have never left our hearts, and you never will." The breakthrough came decades later. Quebec's National Forensic Laboratory successfully extracted DNA from the T-shirt used to restrain Sharon and from other preserved evidence. Investigators partnered with cold case specialists and applied advanced genetic genealogy techniques. Through Y chromosome analysis and database matching, they traced the DNA to the Romine family of West Virginia, USA. In May 2023, police announced they were 100% sure the killer was Franklin Maywood Romine, a U.S. citizen who had lived in Montreal in 1975. Romine's DNA was obtained after exhumation of his remains, matching crime scene material exactly. Police noted that his vehicle matched the tire track pattern at the scene, and his physical description matched the attempted abduction witness account. Having died in 1982, Romine never stood trial. Canadian authorities formally closed the case once the identification was confirmed. For Sharon's family, the disclosure brought mixed relief. Resolution at last, but justice not consummated through prosecution. Her mother Yvonne said in a statement, "We have waited 48 years to hear your name. Now we can begin to breathe." Sister Doreen echoed the relief, saying knowledge of the killer not being on this earth meant he won't kill again. The broader implications touched police agencies across Canada and the U.S. Lead detective Eric Rassicot remarked, "This case shows that time doesn't have to win. Science caught up." Investigators continue to use Romeen's profile to determine whether he may have been linked to other unsolved crimes in Canada and the United States. Even with identification achieved, unanswered questions linger. What triggered Romeen the weekend Sharon was abducted? Did earlier signs of his presence in Montreal go unreported? Why did the investigation initially exclude him despite his criminal record? The tire tracks and restraint t-shirt offered clues but lacked decisive connection at the time. The case remains a study in how evidence can wait decades for its moment. In Longueuil and Pointe-Saint-Charles, memorials now mark Sharon's absence and her family's perseverance. The resolution of Sharon Pryor's murder stands as a testament to the power of preserved evidence, methodical investigation, and modern genetics. Her story reminds us of the human cost of time, the persistence of grief, and the possibilities of bringing light to even the darkest investigations. As the next chapter of this series will explore how genetic genealogy transformed cold case work, we leave here with the knowledge that one family's long wait is nearing its end. But not all answers may ever be found. Case 9. The murders of Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice. In the summer of 1983, the city of Toronto awoke to two tragedies that would go unsolved for decades. In August, 45-year-old Susan Tice, a family therapist and mother of 4, failed to attend a scheduled dinner with her family. A short distance away in her Bickford Park home, her brother-in-law discovered her body. 4 months later, in December, 22-year-old Aaron Gilmore, an aspiring fashion designer living in Yorkville and daughter of businessman David Gilmore, was found dead in her apartment by her boyfriend, arriving late for dinner. At first glance, the two cases appeared unrelated. The victims did not know each other and had different lives. But quietly, they were bound by one ruthless perpetrator. Both women had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death inside their homes. In the early 2000s, forensic testing confirmed the same unknown male had left DNA at each scene, linking Tice's murder to Gilmore's. But law enforcement struggled for years to move beyond the fact of linkage. Headlines faded, files grew cold, and the families waited. Aaron and Susan are finally getting their day, Aaron's brother Sean McCowan said in 2022, decades after the murders. Such words marked both hope and sorrow. In late 2022, the investigation shifted when the Toronto Police Service Cold Case Unit, working with U.S. forensic experts, used investigative genetic genealogy. By uploading the crime scene DNA into genealogical databases, detectives traced relatives and mapped a family tree that led them north. Detective Sergeant Stephen Smith described the process. "We were able to narrow down a suspect family. From there, we arrived at one name. That name was Joseph George Sutherland, a Cree descent man from Moosonee, Ontario, who had been living in Toronto at the time of the murders. He was arrested in November 2022. While the gathering of genealogical leads and family lines is painstaking, it demonstrated how time and distance need not mean justice is forever delayed. In October 2023, Sutherland pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. On March 22, 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 21 years. The court heard how the DNA match was 1 in a billion, based on trace evidence from both scenes. In a statement, Toronto Police Chief James Raymer said, "After 39 years of dogged police work, our investigators have made sure this individual will answer for these terrible crimes." APTN News noted investigators were moving to see if Sutherland's DNA might link him to other unsolved cases across Canada and the U.S. The impact of this breakthrough resonated deeply with the victims' families. For Susan's children and Aaron's brother, the wait was almost a lifetime. "This is a day that I, and we, have been waiting almost an entire lifetime for," Sean McCowan said in 2022. For decades they'd lived with the unknown. No clear reason, no name, no accountability. While the sentence cannot undo what was lost, naming the perpetrator changed everything. The case became emblematic of how modern technology and old-fashioned detective work can intersect to deliver long-awaited answers. Yet even with the resolution, unanswered questions linger. How had Sutherland chosen his victims? What links existed between their neighborhoods and his movements? Why did the crimes go cold for so long, despite the same perpetrator being responsible? Detectives emphasize that although the identity was now known, the investigation into motive and possible other victims continues. The forensic breakthroughs were celebrated, but the human cost remained irreversible. For the Toronto community, the case served as a reminder. Crimes may age, but they do not necessarily expire. The breakthrough reinforced that preserving evidence, maintaining focus, and integrating advanced systems into cold case work can pay dividends, even after decades. Reflecting on the progress, one senior detective said, "This shows that with the right tools, we can still bring answers to victims and families, no matter how long ago the crime occurred." As the courtroom doors closed on the sentencing in March 2024, a chapter of this story turned, but the legacy remains. Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice were more than names on cold case files. They were individuals whose lives mattered. Their families continue to honor their memories, and investigators continue to scan for connections. The chapter ends with a question hanging. If the perpetrator acted twice in 1983, how many times more did he act unseen? The work does not end with a conviction, it evolves from it. Case 10. The Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo. From the mid-1970s through the mid-1980s, communities across California lived in a quiet terror. A man who was once sworn to uphold the law in small-town police departments, transformed into one of America's most cunning and ruthless serial predators. Joseph James DeAngelo Jr., a former officer, would later be known by many names: Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, and finally, the Golden State Killer, as his crimes spread from rural burglary to sexual violence and murder. DeAngelo began his career as a police officer in Exeter in 1973 and later in Auburn until his dismissal in 1979 following a shoplifting conviction. His betrayal of the badge would become part of his methodology. He used knowledge of law enforcement procedures and victim behaviors to evade capture for decades. His first documented attacks were burglaries. He prowled neighborhoods, broke in through windows, stole small items, and observed the households. Over time, his crimes escalated into violent invasions, sexual assaults, and by the late 1970s, murder. Investigators eventually traced his crime spree across more than 10 California counties. By the early 2000s, forensic DNA established that the man responsible for the series of rapes in Sacramento and surrounding counties was the same person who committed murders in Southern California, a revelation that unified once isolated cases under a single perpetrator. Despite this, the man's identity remained out of reach for decades. The breakthrough would come through technology and tenacity. Investigators turned to forensic genetic genealogy, a tactic that involves uploading an unknown DNA profile to a public database, seeking distant relatives, and building a family tree to pinpoint a suspect. In April 2018, DeAngelo was arrested in Citrus Heights at age 72 after detectives gathered discarded DNA from his car door handle and a tissue in his trash, and confirmed a match to the crime scene evidence. At a press conference announcing the arrest, Sacramento County District Attorney Anne Marie Schubert declared, "We knew we were looking for a needle in a haystack, but we also knew the needle was there." Faced with overwhelming evidence, DeAngelo entered a plea agreement in June 2020. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and 13 counts of kidnapping to commit robbery, along with admitting to dozens of rapes and burglaries for which the statute of limitations had expired. At sentencing in August 2020, he received 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional enhancements. Victims, survivors, family members, and communities, long haunted by fear, found themselves at last confronted with a name. "What a gut punch it was that I had been brutally assaulted by a full-time police officer," one survivor testified. D'Angelo's reign of terror ended not because he stumbled, but because science and persistence caught up. Even so, the story leaves deeper questions behind. How had a man entrusted to protect transformed into a predator for so many years? Why had so many innocent leads, resources, and cold case files failed before the genealogy breakthrough? Senior Detective Paul Holes reflected, "We found the guy, but we didn't find justice for every victim. That remains work undone." Still, for hundreds of victims and families, the name Joseph D'Angelo at least offered a sense of closure previously denied. Now incarcerated at California State Prison Corcoran, D'Angelo lives out his final years behind bars, isolated even from the general population. While no further trials await him, the legacy of his crimes continues to shape how law enforcement approaches cold cases, forensic DNA collection, and victim advocacy. The name Golden State Killer may fade with time, but the investigation's ripple remains. For every burglary, every raped victim, every murdered family, the arrest marked a turning point. "It doesn't undo what happened," said a family member of a 1978 murder victim, "but it means someone was held to account." The cliffhanger isn't whether justice was served, but whether the systems of today can stop a next predator before decades of terror ever unfold. Thank you for your incredible support. This channel thrives because of viewers like you. Join our YouTube membership today to unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content, and help us keep creating the stories you love. Which story do you want to be covered?